Hi everyone, Pastor Barry here of Calvary Chapel, Tustin with today's prophecy and the news update. Before we dig in, I know that all of you have heard what's going on over in Manchester, England, and our hearts and our prayers go out to the families of those who have lost a loved one and those suffering and beginning the recovery from catastrophic injuries by this savage terror attack, and reminding us that the Bible said the earth would be filled with violence in the last days, even as it was in the days of Noah. And yet again, we see so many things happening in the world, not just concerning Israel, but concerning the whole of the world, that gives us a rather interesting heads up, if you will, concerning something that I wanted to share with you for some time and maybe shed a little light on something that Jesus mentioned in the Olivet Discourse. We're having a lot of firsts in our day. We've had the first time in U.S. history that a president of the United States, a sitting president that is, has visited and prayed at the Western Wall. We've seen an unprecedented address of one of the most Islamic of all Islamic states when the president addressed 50 Saudi Arabian leaders and asked them to take a stronger stand, as well as the rest of the Arab world, against radical extremist Islam. And at that very time, or days after, I should say, we see this heinous attack in the city of Manchester. Another bomb, by the way, or at least indications of a bomb, went off overnight in a marketplace but was later cleared. So once again, we have the world on edge. We have everybody thinking of and talking about violence. And knowing that in the last days things would be like this, again, there's a couple of things I just want you to consider. One, we know there's going to be a war recorded in Ezekiel 38 and 39. We know the geographic regions of the world based on the record of Noah's descendants in Genesis chapter 10, a chapter known as the Table of Nations, gives us geographic markers and people groups from which we can identify the regions of the world that will be engaged in the Ezekiel 38 invasion. Now, the interesting part about this is when we look to these nations, we know that Turkey and Iran, North African nations, including Libya, Ethiopia, other places, the southern steppes of Russia, are included in there, places where Islam and jihadism are well known. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that even though these particular regions of the world, the nations mentioned by name in Ezekiel 38, are all Muslim nations, they only account for less than 5% of the overall Muslim population around the world. But even though they only account for less than 5% of the general Muslim population, they do also constitute over 90% of radical Islamic activity in the form of jihadism. So what the Bible tells us is that during this time that radical Islam is going to be destroyed when they invade the nation of Israel. God himself is going to intervene, which tells us something of interest. Because this is an act of God, hailstones of fire in Ezekiel 38 and 39, a great earthquake, 5/6 of the armies that invade Israel being completely destroyed, that puts this event inside the tribulation period when God is going to again directly and unquestionably protect the nation of Israel in supernatural means as he did in the days of old. After all, this particular period is known as the 70th week of Daniel. Now, because we're seeing these things begin to come to pass, here's what I wanted to call to your mind and call attention to. Now, I'll say, you know, the surest form of prophetic interpretation is always fulfillment, and there's certain nuances of any prophecy that nobody is going to know absolutely and for sure until it's been fulfilled. And then much like some of the prophecies of Daniel 7 and 8 are like the prophecies of Daniel 7 and 8, we can turn around and look back and see exactly what they meant. Well, these particular prophecies are subtle indeed, but they are of extreme significance. And it concerns something that Jesus said right in the middle of the Olivet Discourse as he was talking to his disciples, answering their questions. It was the most detailed answer to any question he gave in all of Scripture, and it was concerning the last days, which would also include the destruction of the temple. But that was just a small portion of his conversation. The bulk of his conversation was about the signs of his return. Now, if we back up a little bit before the Olivet Discourse, a couple of chapters earlier, Jesus, after the day after, the Bible says, on the next day, after the triumphal entry, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey for the very first time, receiving and accepting public worship, we're told in Matthew that the next day Jesus happened upon a fig tree and he was hungry. And because there were no figs on the tree, he cursed the fig tree because it was fruitless. Now, I have never read one single Bible commentator or heard of any scholar who does not see the fig tree as Israel. Joel 1:7 mentions Israel as a fig tree via an idiom describing them as such. Hosea 9:10 uses the same idiom, calling Israel God's fig tree. So get this once again. After Jesus rode into Jerusalem, in the triumphal entry, the next day he happened upon a fig tree and cursed it for being fruitless, being representative of the nation of Israel, not being ready for their Messiah. Then we're told on the next day they happened upon the same fig tree. Now this is Tuesday of the Passion Week. The very next day, Jesus comes by with the disciples, the same fig tree, and Peter says, "Look, Master, the tree that you cursed is now withered up from the roots," which speaks of the diaspora, the scattering of the nation of Israel until the Lord gathers them back into the land in unbelief, as Ezekiel 37 prophesies. So now we've got a fig tree on Monday, we've got a fig tree on Tuesday. Both times all scholars agree that this is representative of the nation of Israel. Now listen close. On Wednesday, Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 24, "Now learn the lesson from the fig tree." Now, what fig tree is he talking about? He's talking about the same fig tree on Monday, which represented Israel, and on Tuesday, which represented Israel, and now on Wednesday he's talking about a fig tree, the fig tree once again, which represents the nation of Israel. It is inconsistent with biblical interpretation to see the fig tree on Wednesday be different than the fig tree on Monday and Tuesday within the same context, same setting, same people group listening to his teaching. So what did Jesus say about the fig tree? Well, in Luke 21, let me add this. He also said, "Learn from the fig tree and all the trees." Now, some would like to say that this simply means he was giving an illustration, and it is identified as a parable, and it doesn't necessarily represent Israel. Well, I submit to you, it absolutely has to represent Israel, and if the fig tree represents Israel, then all the other trees represent the rest of the world or the rest of the nations, and indeed, it's not just Israel that's going to go through the tribulation. All the world is going to go through the tribulation. So that mention of other trees in Luke 21 does not disqualify the fig tree from representing Israel in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, as it's recorded there. Now, here's the thing. Israel has just celebrated its 69th anniversary as a nation. Just last week, 2 days before President Trump arrived in Israel, they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the city of Jerusalem, the eastern side of the city, which contains the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. So Jesus said, concerning all the things that he was discussing in the Olivet Discourse, when you see these things, learn this from the fig tree. When you see the fig tree budding once again, you know that summer is near. In other words, that language means all the other things here are about to happen. And then Jesus added this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. Now, the first thing for us to understand is nobody knows what a generation actually is meant or means there. It could mean anybody born at the time, could mean a specific time period. There's a little hint in the Psalms that a generation is somewhere around 70 or 80 years, but nobody knows for sure, and we're certainly not into date setting or giving any type of numerological calculation. The fact is, what Jesus said is, when the fig tree buds, that's the last generation before the tribulation, which only lasts for 7 years, and the generation that sees the fig tree bud once again is going to see all the other things happen. So what that tells us is now 69 years into the budding or the rebudding of the fig tree, 50 years now into the liberation of Jerusalem, we are nearing what has to be the last of the last days before the tribulation period. We have indeed signs all around us going on. We have the wars and rumors of wars present. We have rampant pestilence around the world. The seismic activity we talked about, not just geological, but cosmological events, we talked about a few days ago as well. Everything is happening. And Jesus said, without question, and we can understand the interpretation if we stick to and adhere to the rules of hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, we can know that Jesus was saying once Israel is reborn as a nation again, gathered from the countries from which I have scattered her, this is the generation that is going to see all things coming to pass. So what that tells us, if we are seeing precursors to events that will happen during the tribulation period, and as a pre-tribulation rapturist, one who believes that the rapture precedes, or the rapture is even necessary for the 70th week of Daniel to take place, that tells us that our redemption is nigh, as Jesus said, and we are about to be caught up in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, to be snatched away by force to forever be with the Lord, as Jesus promised. He'd gone to prepare a place for us. He's coming again to receive us unto ourselves. Now, that tells us, even in the midst of these difficult things that we're seeing happening in our world, even as we see men being all the things that the Bible described in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, even as we see the violence filling the earth, even as we see the whole world with a drunken hatred of Jerusalem, this is an exciting time to be alive. The Bible is quite clear that Jesus is coming soon, as we're watching all the signs fulfilled around us that give us indication that it's so. But again, we're not saying that it's any date, any particular time, any month of the year, or even any particular year. All we know is that Jesus said there's a final progression to when all is going to be fulfilled. And the initiation point of that period is Israel budding as a nation once again. Well, I hope you're encouraged. I hope you're excited. I hope most of all that what you'll do is go out and tell other people that the Lord is coming soon and He has provided a way for them to be saved. Well, lots of news we're going to be covering in coming days, but I wanted to give you a little insight just from biblical interpretation to hopefully get you revved up a bit and excited about getting out there and telling people about Jesus, because He is coming soon. Well, God bless you guys, and we'll see you next time.